Lena stood in the attic of her grandmother's house, the air thick with dust and memories. Sunlight filtered through the small, dirty window, casting long shadows across the floor. The house had been in the family for generations, a sprawling Victorian mansion that had seen better days. Now, it was hers along with everything inside it. Her grandmother, Edith, had passed away just a week ago, leaving Lena as the sole heir to the estate. Lena hadn't been particularly close to her grandmother. As a child, she remembered Edith as a stern, quiet woman who always seemed to be hiding something. Edith had lived alone for most of her life, her husband having died when Lena's mother was still a child. The house had always felt cold, empty, as if it were holding its breath. Now, as Lena sorted through the old boxes and trunks that cluttered the attic, she felt a strange sense of unease. It was as if the house was watching her, waiting for something. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that it was just an old house filled with old things. There was nothing to be afraid of. As she moved aside a stack of dusty books, she noticed a small, wooden trunk pushed into a corner. The wood was dark and worn, the brass hinges tarnished with age. Curious, Lena knelt down and opened the trunk. Inside, nestled among yellowed lace and brittle paper, was a doll. It was old, far older than any doll Lena had ever seen. The porcelain face was chipped, the once bright paint now faded and cracked. The eyes, a dull blue, stared blankly ahead, and the mouth was set in a grim, tight-lipped smile. The doll's dress was tattered and stained, the fabric brittle to the touch. Lena picked up the doll, feeling an unexpected chill run down her spine as she held it. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her want to put it back in the trunk and forget she had ever found it. But something else, a strange sense of curiosity, compelled her to keep it. It was, after all, a part of her family's history, a relic from a time long past. She placed the doll on a shelf in the living room, intending to ask her mother about it later. But as the days passed, Lena became increasingly uneasy. Strange things began to happen in the house, small at first, but growing more disturbing with each passing day. It started with objects moving on their own. A book she had left on the coffee table would be on the floor the next morning, pages fluttering as if in a breeze. A picture frame she had hung straight would be crooked, tilted at an odd angle. Once, she found a chair pulled out from the dining table, as if someone had been sitting there during the night. Lena tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just her imagination, or perhaps the house settling. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The house, once merely eerie, now felt malevolent, as if it were alive and angry. Then came the whispers. They started at night, just as Lena was drifting off to sleep. Soft, indistinct voices, murmuring in the darkness. At first, she thought it was the wind, or perhaps the old pipes. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until Lena could no longer pretend they were anything other than voices. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, their tones filled with malice and anger. One night, as she lay in bed, trying to block out the whispers, she heard a soft creak from the hallway outside her bedroom. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. The creaking grew louder, closer, until it was just outside her door. She held her breath, her body tense with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The house was silent once again, but Lena knew she wasn't alone. The next morning, she found the doll sitting on the kitchen counter. She was certain she had left it on the shelf in the living room, yet here it was, its blank eyes staring at her as she entered the room. A sense of dread washed over her, and she quickly picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf. But the incident left her shaken, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Lena called her mother that afternoon, hoping to find some answers. Her mother listened patiently as Lena recounted the strange occurrences, her voice trembling with fear. When Lena mentioned the doll, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Lena," her mother finally said, her voice strained, That doll belonged to your great-grandmother. She was very attached to it, carried it with her everywhere. After she died, the doll was passed down to your grandmother. But, there's something you should know. What is it? Lena asked, her heart pounding. Your grandmother told me once that the doll was cursed. She said that after her mother died, strange things started happening in the house. Things like what you've described. She believed the doll was responsible, that it was somehow tied to her mother's spirit. Lena felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Why didn't you ever tell me this? I didn't think it was important, her mother replied, her voice tense. I thought it was just an old family superstition. But now, I don't know. Maybe there's something to it. Lena hung up the phone, her mind racing. A cursed doll? It sounded absurd, something out of a horror movie. But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The strange occurrences had only started after she found the doll. And the whispers, the voices, they seemed to be getting stronger, more insistent, as if they were trying to tell her something. That night, Lena decided to get rid of the doll. She couldn't take the fear anymore, couldn't live in a house that felt like a prison. She took the doll down from the shelf and wrapped it in a cloth, not wanting to touch it with her bare hands. Then she placed it in a box and sealed it shut with tape. She drove to the edge of town, to a place where the river ran deep and fast. The moon was full, casting an eerie light on the water. Lena walked to the edge of the bank and, with a deep breath, threw the box into the river. She watched as it sank beneath the surface, the water swallowing it whole. Relief washed over her as she returned to the car. It was over, she told herself. The doll was gone, and with it, the curse. She drove home, feeling lighter than she had in days. But the relief was short-lived. That night, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever before. Lena lay in bed, her body trembling with fear as the voices surrounded her, filling the room with their hateful murmurs. She tried to block them out, to cover her ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside her head, crawling under her skin, driving her to the brink of madness. And then she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Soft at first, but growing louder, more deliberate. They echoed down the hallway, closer and closer, until they stopped just outside her bedroom door. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the door, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The door creaked open, and Lena screamed as she saw the doll standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes staring straight at her. It was impossible. She had gotten rid of it, thrown it into the river. But here it was, wet and dripping, the cloth that had wrapped it clinging to its porcelain body like a shroud. The doll's mouth, once a tight-lipped smile, was now twisted into a malevolent grin. The doll moved, its tiny feet scraping against the wooden floor as it stepped into the room. Lena scrambled back, her back pressing against the headboard as the doll advanced, its eyes never leaving hers. Why? Lena whispered, tears streaming down her face. Why are you doing this? The doll didn't answer, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. The voices were angry, accusing, as if they were punishing Lena for something she didn't understand. The doll climbed onto the bed, its movements slow and deliberate. Lena was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as the doll crawled closer, its cold, wet hands reaching out to touch her. As the doll's fingers brushed her skin, Lena felt a surge of icy cold shoot through her body. Her vision blurred, her mind screaming in terror as the doll's grip tightened, pulling her down into darkness. The next morning, Lena's body was found lying on the bed, her eyes wide open, her face twisted in a mask of terror. The doll was nowhere to be found. The house was sealed off, left to rot along with the rest of Lena's belongings. The neighbors whispered about what had happened, but no one dared to enter the house. They said it was cursed, that the doll would find its next victim if anyone was foolish enough to disturb it. Years passed, and the house fell into disrepair. But the legend of the doll lived on. People spoke of it in hushed tones, warning others to stay away from the old Victorian mansion at the edge of town. They said that on quiet nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the whispers' voices carried on the wind, calling out for those who dared to disturb the forgotten doll. And deep in the river, beneath the cold, dark water, something stirred.